Guys, what's up? I hope you're all having a great day today. So recently, I've been looking at the news a lot, and I've seen a lot of stuff going on around the Iran situation. I saw like Asmongold, Joe Rogan, a lot of my news channels I keep track of discussing it, and I wanted to make a quick video. I don't feel the most chipper this week. I had a doctor actually I was dealing with getting an injection treatment with that um, was performing malpractice, and I study medicine, and I kind of called her out a little bit on it. I was I just kind of asked for a different provider. But yeah, it's been a little bit of a stressful week, but I'm going to talk about this war stuff, and hopefully I can tell you guys some stuff that would give you some insight into what could potentially happen. So first of all, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because I think the war beginning and starting has shifted the cultural landscape quite substantially. And you just wouldn't think so, right? Because the US and Iran, I mean, whether you go to the east or the west, there's a fair bit of distance there. But it's actually very profoundly impactful to our kind of economic landscape. The Dow Jones has gone down substantially, as well as to the overall kind of geopolitical landscape, almost like playing Risk or Civ 5, right? The interconnection between these countries, there's a dynamic kind of shift when America is unofficially at war, though not a ground war yet. So, first of all, I wanted to go into some really critical questions. I was just using AI to kind of clarify some of my thoughts and positions. So, I was really curious: has the UN or NATO condemned Iran for the actions of the US, right? And so, NATO uh, basically and as well as the UN, it appears, they are not openly pro or anti-US, with a lot of these US airstrikes and military operations that are kind of going on in Iran. It really does seem like uh, collectively, NATO as a collective of in a group of nations are just kind of like, okay, America, you can be the head of the spear, but we don't want to get involved because of our money and our own interest. And that's fine. I think I understand that, but it's just kind of interesting that the implicit precedent is that the US can be kind of the head of the military, kind of geopolitical spear, the war kind of head, and that is basically accepted. It's okay to them. So then getting going from the collective of NATO to the UN, it seems that as well, there's been no unified condemnation of the US from the UN. They're being critical, some individual countries, but it seems like the UN and NATO both are like, okay, the US, you can go ahead and help with this conflict between Iran and Israel, but we don't want to get that involved. And most of us are kind of like lukewarm on it, which has shifted a bit since the Strait of Hormuz situation, more towards the US's perspective. So overall, I just want to say I don't hate the UN and I don't hate NATO. I just really think it gets to the point to where it's kind of silly. Like it's a pretense where the US, the president changes, but the foreign policy does not seem to. And it seems that every time when the U.S., does military action, the UN and NATO basically sit on their hands and do nothing. And somehow, for one reason or another, American money is spent on foreign wars. I think there's a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King where he says, if we can spend millions and billions of dollars on foreign wars, then we can spend the same amount to fix and correct the problems in this country. But that kind of foreign policy president has not seemed to shift. It has not shifted, unfortunately, since his time. So just to quickly kind of clarify, Iran is aggressing on Israel, and I would say in many ways, I understand the principle of helping out an ally protect itself, but it just seems like it's coming down to drone warfare. Iran launching missiles and drones at Israel, and President Trump, before the Strait of Hormuz has now escalated due to oil prices, was already kind of foreshadowing that nations would probably have to get more involved with the situation. Uh, you know, and I'll say this: it just seems like the strategy of trying to have America be the global police force is just not effective. You know, and the logic of our policies so far, I think, are inevitably going to lead us to going to war regardless. The U.S. has contributed about 183 billion by Congress to Ukraine, 83 billion actually directly sent, and 127 billion in aid alone to Ukraine, right? And so the U.S. has provided about half of all the military aid to Ukraine. So we keep spending money on foreign wars, right? And if you look back at Pearl Harbor, we were getting financially involved with a lot of World War II, and that's what caused Japan to want to do a surprise attack against us, right? And so history will probably, in that sense, repeat itself if we continue to spend massive amounts of money on foreign wars. It will lead to more of an escalation. I've been saying that for a while. It has already. We are unofficially at war with Iran. We're doing I think mainly Air Force and kind of you know, financial, bombings and things such as that. But it just seems to me that we're going to go to war inevitably. I've been saying that for a while. If you sit there and fund and throw money at a war, it's really not that different logically, consistently from, just being in the war itself. So, yeah, and here's a quick map of a lot of the Ukraine and Russia situation. It seems that Ukraine and Russia are just at this extended standstill where they're throwing massive amounts of billions of dollars of drones at each other. There's not really much going on. Russia has been making some pretty stupid strategic mistakes. They've been having soldiers drinking on the front line because they're depressed, and it's just this very dysfunctional situation. Some more money on the U.S. spending in the Iran-Israel war. The U.S. has spent about 11.3 billion in the first weeks of fighting for Israel, 5 to 6 billion in the first 48 hours, and 800 million to 1 billion per day, typically, with peaks up to 2 billion per day early on in the war. So, it's just silly. We continue to throw billions of dollars at the, you know, Ukraine and Russian war and the Israel and Iran Israel Hamas war. It's just silly. And Iran is financially funding Hamas, and they were in the first place. That's why things have escalated this way. It's just childish. We might as well just declare war. We've been at war for so long financially. The difference becomes rather arbitrary when you see these kinds of numbers. I've been saying this for I'd say for years, honestly. And so the big word that Trump doesn't like, there's one N word you can't say, and that is nuclear, right? You can't say the nuclear word. And I think it's really tough because, uh, the idea of the U.S. trying to control the nuclear programs of foreign countries is an incredibly stupid and ineffective idea. I don't think that America can just sit there and point their finger and wag it and say, no, 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 Iran, because we bomb their nuclear facilities. We're not going to let you have any of these nuclear weapons. We are the geopolitical police force. I think that's incredibly narcissistic, just conceptually, on a very baseline level. I don't think it actually makes any logical sense to try to control the nuclear program of a different country. Iran, if they really want their nukes, they will get their nukes. If they really wanted to produce their own nukes, they will do that. If they wanted nukes there now, right, through foreign trading, it would happen. The U.S. cannot control the nuclear programs of other countries. That's just a stupid God complex. Technology is advancing too quickly. And so the US in opposition to Iran having nuclear weapons isn't just based on one reason, it's a mix of security, power, and global stability concerns. So obviously protecting Israel, one of the first ones, we'll just check that off. Preventing a nuclear arms race because Saudi Arabia is a financial kind of partner and trading partner to the US makes sense. It makes sense how Iran could sit there and look and be like, well, they're a problem. And they actually have, Iran has done a scattering uh, of like air base strikes on various Middle Eastern countries, and the Ukraine actually had to go in and do counter, strike, basically counter like actions to some of their chaotic strikes against some of these foreign Middle Eastern countries, very sadly. But it just seems like it seems like the idea is if we can just stop Iran from having nuclear weapons, they won't be a similar extent of valid to Israel. They won't have this ability to kind of put the meat on the table, put their skin in the game, right, and say, hey, we're going to push the button. But I just don't think you can control that. I don't think that's practical personally. um, we'll look at this real quick. I was really curious, has China or Russia gotten involved with the nation of Iran receiving nuclear weapons? So there's no confirmed evidence, it says, but Iran, America basically is saying, hey, like they can have nuclear power, not nuclear weapons, okay. But it seems that Russia has built and operated parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. So they are basically partnering with them in that. And they have long-term nuclear and defense agreements with them, and they're basically a partner in nuclear, pursuits. And China as well has also contributed to Iran, also has contributed to Iran's nuclear research infrastructure. So it's like if the logical consistency is we are going to control Iran's nuclear weapons, then we're going to have to start stepping in and basically telling China and Russia what they can and cannot do with their money. I just think that's incredibly stupid. I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the Trump cabinet and with the American foreign policy. If you look at a lot of the Afghanistan and Iran war, like death toll numbers, the reason people think that it was a stupid and idiotic war is because there's actually releases from those wars via WikiLeaks where there would be hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths confirmed that would never be publicly released until I'd say far after or not at all during the war. And so if there's just massive amounts of civilian deaths, and if the people of the Middle East are basically just like somewhat aligned and somewhat misaligned with their government concerning the Iran situation, there's not going to be a magical uprising to where the US are like these kind of savior good guys. I think there's people in the Middle East who genuinely hate Israel and just want it not to exist. And so it's kind of here's a map just to contextualize it. But yeah, it's sad. It's a very sad situation. There's not much to say, honestly. It's just very unfortunate. But the idea that we can stop Iran from trading with China and Russia to get nukes is a stupid idea. That's a I think a scapegoat. I think the controlling their nuclear weaponry is basically an excuse just to get involved. I don't even think practically speaking a lot of military strategist in the US would even expect that to be a reasonable expectation long term. We're just making excuses to get involved with the war. I think it's just as I have said, a moral decay. So and also just so people know why, this is escalated from Israel and Hamas, which was right around to the east uh, kind of south of the Jordan, that little confrontation. The reason why, Israel kind of clapped back at Iran and vice versa is because Iran was funding Hamas and supporting the Houthis and other kind of split terrorist group factions. So yeah, they are some bad guys though. Like that is true. Like they are bad guys. But if America actually getting involved helps or just puts oil on the fire, who knows? Also, this has been going on for uh, just a few months now, since February 2026, and it's already escalated so quickly. So as soon as Iran and Israel were officially at war, it was like, oh gosh, like this is gonna like we're already spending so much money on this stuff. Like the normative kind of extent to which the public can accept aggression in our foreign policy is just going to break and give way. I think a ground war is inevitable personally. I think that will happen inevitably. Um, quick map of Russia so you can kind of contextualize where it is relative to Iran and China. But yeah, I think there's a big key change that's occurring that people don't want to talk about. And I think the reason we're going to go to a ground war is that drones have basically changed the entire game of warfare, right? So people will say, oh no, America has an air force. We're not going to go to a ground war. We don't need to. But it's actually 60 to 80% of battlefield casualties are now with drones, right? And 10,000 drones per day are used across the battlefield. So America being involved on the ground with drone technicians is basically inevitable. Ukraine has, as it says here, has produced millions of drones per year, and Russia has launched 50,000 plus attack drones in 2025. So it's like the idea that, oh no, America has an air force. We're not going to sit there and go to war because, our air force is so incredible and no one's going to have to go to the ground and, have to deal with IEDs and stuff. It's like, no, that's not realistic. That's a very silly idea. Drone warfare is the future. The chances of us going to ground war is far more substantial than I think a lot of people think. But it is what it is. So yeah, and I don't want to go. I'm just showing some data here, but yeah, drones are huge. I mean, they're massive. Ukraine has used drones to hit 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity. They can destroy tanks, they can destroy air defense stuff and infrastructure. I mean, I've seen videos of this. Like drones are literally the meta. Like if you're playing a video game, you spec your skill tree into drones or you lose. And here's some yeah, a little bit of a visual here, but it's you know, I just think at a certain point it's just like, dang, dude, like the chances of us going to a ground war are there. Like it's more substantial than a lot of people want to think. And these drones really are the future, and they have completely changed the entire landscape and field of warfare. It's you can't sit there and say that like ground war is completely out of the possibility. That's not realistic. That's a very much, I think, a perspective of a hopeful optimism and a clinging to one's humanity. But I think we've given so many billions and we've destroyed so many human lives with the billions that we've given to these foreign wars. I don't think the idea of a ground war is it's inevitably going to happen. I've been saying this for 2 years. And so it's kind of funny what there's actually this is a SPV drone controller and you can just imagine like you get some kid who's been playing Fortnite and you give him this controller and he's like sitting there he has like a brick of C4 attached to it. It's like what is this? Like it's actually crazy. Like similar to video game controller looking like mechanisms are being used to control drones, right? Because it's appealing to people, like it works. And it's really interesting if you go back to the World Wars, the hand grenade was actually modeled after the football and the baseball. So, like imagine World War II, you get all these hand grenades, and kids back then were playing way more sports. It was literally made to model the football and baseball. So, the way I see it is if we're going to World War III is kind of a stupid question because the nature of war has changed so much. It would never be anything near similar to World War III. It's not going to be like guys with grenades and bunkers and, like throwing the proverbial, pigskin football. Like, it's going to be kids. It's going to be young men with controllers being epic gamers on the battlefield with drones with explosives, SPV explosives attached to them. It's very dark actually. And so, yeah, a lot of these people saying like, "Oh, things are going to escalate to World War III." That is, I think, kind of a stupid way of seeing the paradigm. I see these Asmongold videos all the time where he's like, "Oh, things are going to go to World War III, World War III." No, like it's just not that simple anymore. And if it was, I would be happy. Like, oh, like then we can just discuss if it's World War III. But that's a president that is as a president that is stupid. That is a implied, argument. That is a stupid argument. Um, It's just, and the idea of America controlling Iran's nuclear facilities, that is absolutely idiotic. That makes no sense whatsoever. That's simply a excuse to get us into a ground war. 100%. Yeah, I don't think the government's that stupid. So I accept it for what it is. I don't hate the government, but at the end of the day, hey, this is just where things are at.